Let's break down both of these facets, the war on Ukraine as well as Putin's presidency. So you're saying he does look weaker. What does this mean for his legitimacy as president? Do you think his days as Russian president are limited?
It's really hard to tell. And a lot of people believe that the reason that Putin has stayed in power as long as he has is sort of for two reasons. First, the system is set up so that it benefits everybody. It doesn't work efficiently. It's based on graft, but everybody who's in a position of power gets to take their little bit off the top, and nobody wants to disrupt that because that is how the stability is kept. That is how everybody gets their money, and everybody would like to keep that the way it is. The second reason why he has stayed in power as long as he has is that there's no obvious alternative. There's nobody in particular who could keep that balance between all of the ambitious people and ensure that they continue all to get paid off the way that they've been paid off. And so for that reason, there has been a reluctance to disrupt the system. The only way that his days would be numbered is if he has become so weakened that a sufficiently large and significant group of top officials have come to the conclusion not only that Putin is no longer an effective leader, but that there is somebody else that they would rather see than Putin being in charge, and that then they somehow all agree with each other that this is a good move to make and the time to make it is point X. And the problem is, of course, that they're all being watched by the security services. And so nobody can trust anybody else. And so it's not just a matter of getting rid of Putin. It's a question of if you get rid of Putin, how do you replace him and how do you do it without anybody getting hurt in the process? Because it's a very risky thing to think about doing.
And is there any indication that there's that sort of top level mutiny that could happen?
No. And, it was pretty striking that everybody was so quiet when all of this was happening. On the one hand, there was nobody who was coming out except those initial helicopter and airplane forces to try to stop Prigozhin from going forward. But on the other hand, there was nobody who had any position of authority who was coming out in support of him. And we did see a lot of, the population in Rostov cheering on Prigozhin. But do keep in mind, he's a war hero because of what his forces were able to accomplish just across the border in Ukraine, because especially of the really brutal Battle of Bakhmut, where they threw themselves at the Ukrainian forces and managed to hold on to the territory. So we don't really know what that cheering was about, whether that was about Prigozhin taking on the authorities, or whether that was just showing support for what Prigozhin and his forces had done in Ukraine. But we have not seen anybody in circles of power speaking out on behalf of Prigozhin. Instead it has been really radio silence from everyone in the Kremlin.
Now let's talk about Ukraine. As you noted earlier, Prigozhin has been really vocal in criticizing the war. So is there any indication that this failed rebellion will have any implications on the war in Ukraine?
That's a really good question. And I think the one thing people are watching is whether the ordinary fighting forces are going to start expressing dismay and have low morale over what they're doing in the field. It's not clear what kind of information they have, because supposedly they had their cell phones taken away from them, but we do know that some of them still have had their cell phones and still have been posting things on their cell phones. So we don't know what the level of communication has been with the Russian forces on the ground in Ukraine with what has been happening in Russia itself. But presumably at some point they'll find out. And the question is, will this sense of weakness that the regime has in place, this sense that maybe their justification for going to war in Ukraine was not accurate, was not meaningful, will that start having an effect on these ordinary fighters thinking, what in the world am I doing here? Why aren't they treating me better? Maybe this Prigozhin has something to him. Maybe he's telling us some truths that we have to hear. And is it possible that there could be some form of mutiny that spreads throughout the Russian forces? And again, mutiny might not be turning their weapons against the Russian state. It might be instead just a higher desertion rate, refusing to fight, seeing the forces being less effective on the ground because they have lost their sense of morale and their sense of purpose. But that's a question that everybody's going to be watching over the next few weeks.
And I'm really curious as well as to what the sentiment is on the ground in Russia. How are everyday Russians responding to this? What do they think of this chaos?
Well, there's no real way to know. If you're an ordinary Russian at this point, you're not going to put your neck out by saying anything publicly about what's going on. And so even there was a very reliable Russian polling organization, and recently people have even come to doubt whether the results that come out of that polling organization are meaningful, because are you going to speak to a stranger and tell them what you really think about what anything's happening in Russia? So it's hard to know, but it does appear that people are more or less going about their daily lives not being willing to stick their head out over anything. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
And Dr. Marten, you're an expert in this area, so I'm curious, where do we go next? What should we look out for?
What we should be looking out for is whether Prigozhin actually shows up in Belarus. If he does show up in Belarus, does he have a group of Wagner forces with him? And was this all, in one sense, at least have the effect of an arrangement of now having Wagner forces deployed in Belarus, perhaps to support the regime of Lukashenko, who has been facing his own set of high protests and could use some help from Wagner? The second thing to look out for is what happens with Russian forces in Africa. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, just about an hour before you and I started talking, came out with a statement saying, you African leaders do not fear. The Wagner group is doing good work in Africa. You will continue to be supported. Nothing will change. And then the third thing to look out for is what happens with the high-level representatives of the defense ministry and the general staff. Do we see any shakeup of who those personnel are? Does it imply that Prigozhin actually had some impact? And then I guess the final thing to watch for is this potential for a crackdown by Putin to say to people, I'm still strong, don't think I'm weak. I'm still in charge, and I'm going to show you I'm in charge.